Hello, everybody, and welcome to week 6, week 6 of 8. So we're getting pretty close to the end of the semester, and after this, we only have 2 more weeks. So I think it's going pretty well. I've read through, I think I'm caught up on everything except for the outlines, and I've been really happy with what everybody's been doing so far. The outlines that I have looked at have been pretty solid. You know, there's some issues with some using your in-text citations particularly well, but you know that's kind of what that is attempting to do. So hopefully that's something that you'll learn by the paper, and I'll have comments for you on that. But yeah, so I'm really happy where we're at. This week we're going to be working on the draft. At this point, sort of like I mentioned when talking about the outline, if you had a suitably detailed outline, the transition from outline to draft is going to be a pretty easy one. You're going to find that depending on how detailed your draft is, you're going to be able to take some of that information almost directly over. Of course, you can't just copy and paste it over and be like, I'm done. Even if you had like an 8-page outline, you do need to still make sure that it functions as a paper. You need to make sure that you have the connective tissue, that there's transitions, that you are still writing a paper. But you will find that if you've structured everything right, and if you've already found the evidence that you're going to use via your sources, that's going to take away most of the work. So kind of moving onward from that, this week we're doing the draft. There's a couple chapters to really look into: citing properly, starting page 193, and drafting your project on 170 to 180 something. I'm not sure why that clipped out. But yeah. And then, of course, there are the extra resources this week. Examples, and as I always say, the example is going to make your life much easier if you actually read through them and see kind of like what these essays are looking like. Formatting the APA essay, this is going to help you just kind of, although stuff about APA formatting is in the book, this will kind of like break that down a little bit more. And then just a document talking about effective citation of sources. Again, some of this is already stuff that we've talked a little bit about, that you've read a little bit about, but these are more straightforward like guides. Like, this is a way that you can effectively cite your sources. So hopefully that's not too bad. Here we go. Okay. So this is a pretty short video because there's not quite as much to talk about. Everything has sort of been leading to this draft. You already have all your sources. You already have, your research question has been answered at this point. You should have a pretty solid thesis. Your lit review has sort of shown, at least hopefully shown, I would say mostly, you've all done a fairly good job at that. More than a fairly good job. You have all done a very good job. With a few exceptions. Like, that you know what your topic is. So now really at this point your essay is going to be about showing that you have a thesis and proving that thesis. And that's really what we've been working up to. You have a mastery of the topic, of course. 6 weeks isn't enough to really become a master on a topic, but you have done the research, you have knowledge about this topic that's greater than the average person. You have direct research and direct evidence. So now you're basically just going to be turning that outline into a paper that can look at this thesis and prove through the use of evidence, through the sources you've used, and through your own logic and your own thoughts. That's one thing that a lot of people have trouble with, is that they over-rely on their sources to the point where they might be quoting most of the body paragraphs or just quotations of the sources. And although we do want to make sure that we're using our sources pretty frequently, we also want to make sure that this is our own argument, our own thoughts. it's going to be informed by these sources. These sources are going to be the evidence we're using to prove these thoughts, but you do want to make sure you're not just essentially just copying and pasting over the information. The lit review is more in that summary vein, even though we were meant to synthesize. Whereas this paper, you are making this argument and you are letting these sources back up your words. Okay, so that's like sort of the basics of what I expect. Like the Moodle says, this is going to either be a cause and effect or problem solution paper. You can do it other ways, but those are the some of the easier structures to think about. I always tell people that cause and effect can be useful, although that tends to be more useful in like natural sciences than social sciences, because cause and effect in social sciences can sometimes edge towards being a little bit informative. But I always suggest problem solution papers, because then you're making an argument. You're saying this thing is a problem. You're proving that it is a problem, and then you're saying, and these are solutions to it. So not only are you arguing that it's a problem, but you are showing that moving forward, you can, we can make an active change. And this is useful because one of the weaknesses of a lot of informative papers is they can show us that there might be something, something negative is going on. But most informative papers, if there is going to be any talk about solutions, it's going to be in the conclusion in like a sentence or two. And really, when we're thinking about this larger argument that we're trying to make here, being like, okay, here's a problem, I am saying that this is the cause of whatever my thesis is, or the problem my thesis is tackling. And this is an active way that we can do this. It's not necessarily, you don't have to go to the problem solution. It just is a structure that naturally leads itself to this kind of paper. It automatically assumes you're arguing something, it automatically assumes you have a stance, and it also automatically assumes that you are going to be making an attempt to make the problem go away, as opposed to simply just showing that this is a problem. So yeah, that's usually my those are the two kind of approaches that social sciences usually use, and I usually suggest for the problem solution strategy. Although the cause and effect can still be great. I mean, especially if you're talking about, like I said, it's a little bit better in natural sciences, because often in social sciences things are a little bit too nebulous. But if you're talking about the cause of, I don't know, if you're talking about why there's food scarcity in this location, and you might say a part of one of the causes of food scarcity is the political vacuum after a local war, which is something we see a lot, especially in developing countries. There'll be a war, and then a famine will lead after it because the crops might have been burnt or stolen or whatever, and then there's not as much food, and then chaos happens. So you might say this war caused the food scarcity. Of course, you have to do more than that. You have to if that is your argument, you have to show it and show that evidence. But it's still a good way to do it. Okay, so also strong use of evidence from reliable sources. At this point, you all should have some fairly reliable sources. There have been a couple people that I've had to that I've had to remind over and over again that they don't have strong sources. So I hope by now you can really work those strong sources in. But that's something that most of you don't have to worry about. Most of you have already found good, strong sources. Again, argument-based, strong thesis statement, extensive and appropriate usage of APA citations. This is something that a lot of people have problems with. And I think I mentioned this a little bit last week, but one really common thing for people to do is just do a lot of paraphrasing and summarizing, and then just tack a in-text citation at the end of the paragraph. I'll see entire papers that don't use any direct quotations, and they'll just like say a bunch of stuff, and at the end they'll be like in parentheses the author's name, the date, and that's not really what we're trying to do here. That denotes a kind of on one end it denotes a lack of confidence that makes your reader and also your instructor worried that you don't really know how to cite, and that you're just kind of like, you don't know how to cite, so you're doing this to sort of cover your bases. And that lack of confidence can hurt your argument. It can be like, okay, well, this person obviously doesn't really know how to use these sources. They're just trying to ride off of the authority of these sources. Also, it can be a sign of sort of academic like laziness. Like, oh, well, I don't actually want to bother to learn how to do this, so if I just tack a thing at the end, then that's good. That's not to say you can't have summary and paraphrasing. Absolutely. You want to make sure that you're using summary, paraphrasing, and direct quotations. But a lot of times people, for whatever reason, oftentimes just lack of confidence, they will not use direct quotations because they're afraid they're not going to do it right. And they're afraid that if I use this direct quotation, if I don't cite it correctly, it's going to be plagiarism. And, that's not the case. Make sure that you have it cited. Even if it's not cited like 100% correctly, it's better than not citing it at all. So make sure that you have your stuff cited in text. Remember, for APA, that's going to look like a signal phrase that's followed by the quotation or whatever, and then, well, it'll be signal phrase, and then in parentheses, it'll be the date, and then following either the paraphrase, the summary, or the direct quotation. So, for instance, it might be like in his essay, unethical tea farming in India. I don't remember who wrote that, but I did read it recently. Oh, yeah, there's my cat, Seamus. He's adorable, but he's also kind of awful. I love him. Anyways, so I'd say like Dr. Smith, in his article titled Unethical Farming and Tea Plantations in India, says that blank. So that would be the signal phrase, would be like Dr. Smith, and then after Dr. Smith you would, in parentheses, 2017. I don't know. As you can tell, I don't really remember much from this article if I can't. But anyways, that doesn't matter. It's the example. So, signal phrase, leading into it, giving us context, and then in parentheses the date, and then the rest of the sentence. And that's really what you want for everything. Of course, there are reasons to not use a signal phrase. There are stylistic reasons not to use a signal phrase. But it is obvious when you're not using a signal phrase because of stylistic reasons, and you're not using a signal phrase because you either don't know how to do so, or whatever reason. So just kind of keep that in mind. You need those elements. And then the whole well-written attention to grammar and structure. Like I've mentioned before, although the writing is one element of this, really the class is more interested in doing overtime, like doing the research process and determining how to use that information effectively. A lot of you do have some grammatical issues and some problems, and unless if they're big enough to where it's distracting, which is often the case with like very basic stuff like paragraph structure, or like sentence structures that don't work. Like for instance, if you have a lot of fractured, like sentence fragments, if you have a lot of like run-on stuff that just make it difficult to actually follow what you're doing, I tend not to be too over the top on that. Okay, otherwise, like basic requirements of this: 2,500 words. So it's gonna be around 8 pages. I like double spaced, but 2,500 words. So it's a good chunk of paper. And then the final paper will be basically 10 full pages. Last semester it was at 10 and then 12, and I rolled it back a little bit because I found that extra 2 pages, most people couldn't reach that with what they're working, so I found this to be a better distance, especially for the online course. At least I'm hoping that's kind of the experiment here. Title page, the text of the essay, the actual essay itself needs to be 2,500 words, not just the document you're giving me, so keep that in mind. Your reference page, with all your works cited page, everything you're doing, and make sure you have your in-text citations. There's there's a rubric that is included in the Moodle, the actual Moodle document. If you open up the document, it has all the information on it, and it's like the other rubrics you've seen me use, and that's basically how I'm going to grade it. So if you've seen the other rubrics I've used, and if you kind of know how to follow those, you'll know pretty quickly what I'm going to do. Okay. Otherwise, what other things I need to tell you? So this was originally due on the 1st, which was the Sunday, but because it's Thanksgiving, I've decided to give you guys a little bit of extra time to make it due on Tuesday instead of Sunday, just because I know that for a lot of you, you're going to be traveling a lot. You're going to be doing a lot of, even if you're not traveling, you're not necessarily going to be in this mental space to be writing an 8-page paper. That doesn't mean you shouldn't get started. Obviously, you shouldn't just write the paper in the 2 days before class, but I kind of wanted to give you a little bit extra time. That way, if you don't have to stress the entire week about getting it done on Sunday, because that's not going to be fun. But other than that, that's the only assignment due this week. Technically due next week. Next week, you will have the reflection, which will be due on the Wednesday, so you'll have the paper, and then the very next day will be the reflection. But the reflection is pretty simple. It tells you, just like the last couple discussion forums, pretty straightforward. Just kind of asking specific questions for you to sort of reflect on. And then next Sunday will be the reverse outline, which is both an easy and difficult assignment. In some ways, it's easy to get done, but it's sort of a lot of thought. And I'll talk about that more next week. Anyways, I don't have too much more to say. I hope you all have had a fantastic weekend, and I look forward to talking to you all soon. Bye.